Well, good morning. God bless everybody. We're coming into the fall season of the Christian year where you, at least in the United States, we have you have October 31st, which gets named Halloween, but really was the day that Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg on October 31st of 1517, which de facto started the Protestant revolution. What one man can do, just amazing. and then of course we move into Thanksgiving and we move into Christmas, the day we recognize Christ's birth. And so I thought it would be a good time if we would take a look at what God did with his calendar. And I'm astounded at how scattered this is. This is complete proof that God wants us to spend time with him, dig into what he said in the word, be willing to take mental notes, if you will, and physical notes so that we can build an understanding of what God wanted. And one of the things that became clearer to me as I was preparing for this teaching than it's ever really been before is frankly how annoying, I'm going to use that word, the way God designed the feasts could be. Like, for example, if you think about it, put yourself back in Tent City in Israel, and you've got the Sabbath coming every single week. And God says, in the book of Numbers, they stoned a man to death for collecting wood. So if you're going to prepare for the Sabbath, you can't cook, you can't build a fire. So somebody in your household needs to stay up the night before the fire. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but and keep that fire going, and so the next day you can have warmth if it's a cold part of the year. And you've got to have your wood already cut and stacked and right there, because heaven forbid you don't want to be killed for collecting wood. That's for sure. So God's feasts and Sabbaths and rest days, and I didn't even cover all of them, demand something of us and will interrupt our lives to the point that they make it a constant reminder that we are to remember God. Now, if you want to follow this in commentary, because I've got most of it, not all of it, but most of it I'll add to it tomorrow, in the commentary on Leviticus 23, verse 2 in the REV. So where I want to start with the daily offerings, because 365, well, actually, they had a lunar year. So 354 days a year, which was their whole year, they had to do daily offerings at the temple. So the priests and Levites stayed busy. So for that one, let's go to Numbers chapter 28. And in Numbers chapter 28, we're going to start right in verse 1. Verse 1, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, by the way, I had a discussion recently, just this week, with somebody who said, how was the Bible given? I mean, was the Bible just like holy people that kind of were inspired? They were good men, and they were just inspired to write about God, and what they said was mostly true. And I said, no. I said, Timothy says the Bible is God-breathed, theopneustos. And I know that there are people, godly people, who don't believe what I believe about this, but God can speak. There are many, many people that have audibly heard the voice of God or the voice of Jesus Christ, or seen him in a vision and heard him speak. And I think many of you have been in that position as well. And there's absolutely no reason why we can't believe that God spoke to those rare authors who wrote down the scriptures. So here in verse 1, it says, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying. Now, what did that sound like? Hey, Moses, You know, that's that's what it sounded like. I'm reminded right now of a number of years ago. I was listening to a man. He's now passed away, Del Duncan, and he had some children, and he had a boy that he particularly knew was being guided by the Lord. And so here's this little kid, and Del calls him over and says, "Hey," his name was Luke. "Hey, Luke, God must speak to you. When God speaks to you, what does he say?" And this little boy put on his deepest voice and he said, "Dad, God says, 'Hey, Luke.'" I mean, God can speak to people, and then people write it down. God would talk to this little kid and he would do things in the right way. So here Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, "Command the children of Israel and tell them, my approach offering, my food for my offerings made by fire of a pleasant aroma to me, you must observe to offer me in their due season." Verse 3, you are to tell them this. "This is the offering made by fire that you are to offer to Yahweh. Male lambs a year old without blemish, 2 lambs each day for a regular burnt offering." So this is the temple of God, and there's 2 lambs offered every single day. He says, verse 4, you are to offer 1 lamb in the morning. You are to offer the other lamb at evening. Verse 5, with 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour for a grain offering, mixed with the 4th part of a hin of beaten oil. And people don't realize this, but the regular offerings were not just the animal. The regular offerings were the blood sacrifice, the grain sacrifice, and the oil sacrifice twice a day, every day. Now, this is one of the reasons when we go back to Genesis chapter 4, and it says Cain's offering was not accepted before the Lord, then I've heard people teach, well, the reason Cain's sacrifice wasn't accepted was because he offered a grain offering and not a blood offering. Hold on just a second. I'm sorry, my computer is yelling at me. I don't know why. Okay, I think I shut it up. But anyway, so if God is going to command that a regular grain offering be offered, he's going to accept a grain offering. And we see through Leviticus, Deuteronomy particularly, that he does. So the reason Cain's offering wasn't accepted was because he didn't offer the best, and he didn't offer it with the right heart. So let's go back to Numbers. And so he says, you offer it this evening with the flour, with the oil. Verse 6, it's a regular burnt offering that was ordained at Mount Sinai for a pleasant aroma, for an offering made by fire to Yahweh. Verse 7, its drink offering is to be the 4th part of a hin for the 1 lamb, which means, of course, it's the 4th part of a hin for the other lamb. You are to pour out a drink offering of beer to Yahweh in the holy place. By the way, the drink offering of beer, in the earlier versions, Tyndale, Wycliffe, Geneva, King James, and whatever, they didn't realize this was beer. They knew it was a drink, and they knew it was some kind of intoxicating thing or whatever. And so it gets translated strong drink, and many people misunderstand that to be something like liquor. But the ancients had no way to actually distill liquor until much, much later in history. In fact, it was still way after the time of Christ that genuine distillation of liquor could be done. So there's no Jim Beam or Jack Daniels or anything like that until way after the time of Christ. And so what is sometimes translated strong drink has been translated beer. And that's what it is. And now the archaeologists and historians know that. Most of your modern versions will read that way. So it's a drink offering of beer to Yahweh in the holy place. Verse 8, the other lamb you are to offer at evening. You are to offer it just like the grain offering of the morning, and like its drink offering, it's an offering made by fire of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. So this was the daily offering. It was offered every single day, like I say, 354 days a year. And this is one of the reasons that the temple complex had to have its herds or its suppliers of lambs, because and oil and grain, because you needed those, whether it was the grain harvest season or the oil harvest season or whatever. So they had to invent ways to store those things that are harvested so they would have them all year long. So then verse 9 starts out with the Sabbath offering. So let's take a look at the Sabbath offering. It says, on the Sabbath day, offer 2 male lambs a year old without blemish, and 2/10 part of an ephah of fine flour for a grain offering mixed with oil, and the drink offering of it. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath, beside the regular burnt offering and the drink offering of it. Now, you'd think it would say, like, switch, like the Sabbath offering would be 2 male lambs instead of 1 male lamb. But the daily offering was a daily offering, absolutely set. 1 lamb in the morning with the meal and the oil, 1 lamb in the evening with the oil and the meal. When the Sabbath came, you offered 2 additional lambs in the morning and in the evening. And people need to be aware of that. So every Sabbath, and then every day was an offering. Then every Sabbath was a special offering. And then, like I said, on this, and Jesus Christ, by the way, is going to point this out when the Pharisees during his ministry accuse him of healing on the Sabbath. He talks about the priests working on the Sabbath, and they had to work more than twice as hard on the Sabbath as any other day in order to meet God's regulations. And like I say, everybody else, when it came to the Sabbath, it was a day of rest, but it was more than that. Let's go to Exodus chapter 16. And in Exodus chapter 16, we're going to see the start of the Sabbath. Now, some people think the Sabbath observance went all the way back to Genesis. There's absolutely no record of that or any indication that actually happened. For example, there's no indication that Abraham or Jacob or any of those people recognized the Sabbath. God had said that the 7th day was holy, but there weren't any commands to do anything about it. So Exodus chapter 16 is the start of the Sabbath. And so we go to verse 23, and Israel now is in the wilderness. And so Exodus 23, he said to them, this is what Yahweh has spoken. So Moses is talking to the children of Israel, and he said, this is what Yahweh had spoken. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and this is of the manna and what they had in the desert, and all that remains over, set aside for yourselves to be kept until the morning. Verse 24, they set it aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it did not stink, nor were there any worms in it. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you are to gather it. That's your 6 days of work. But on the 7th day, a Sabbath, on it there will be none, no manna in the field on the Sabbath. Yet it came to pass on the 7th day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Duh. Verse 28, Yahweh said to Moses, how long? And this is funny coming from God, because Israel by this time has only been out in the wilderness for like less than a month. He's going to get the 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, and they'd been out 2 months at that point. So God's been putting up with Israel for less than a month. Excuse me, I don't know why my voice is rough today. God has been putting up with Israel for less than a month, and he says, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? And I look at the world today and I'm like, God, how long are you going to leave the Lord in heaven? Isn't it time to send him back? My gracious. But anyway, so he says, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments? Verse 29, behold, because Yahweh's given you the Sabbath, the rest, therefore he gives you on the sixth day the bread for 2 days. Everyone stay in his place, let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. So then the people rested the seventh day. Now God's going to codify more completely the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments. So let's go to Exodus 20. And it's interesting that God speaks the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, and then there's a repeat of them in Deuteronomy 5. And when it comes to the Sabbath, there's a significant difference. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath day. Verse 9, work 6 days, do your work. Verse 10, the seventh day is a Sabbath. You must not work, not anybody, not your son, daughter, male servant, female servant. Don't even have your animals work. That means no plowing behind your oxen, that kind of thing, nor your stranger who is inside your gates. Nobody inside the territory of Israel is supposed to work. And then in verse 11, he says, for in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath. Now I'd like to go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Because there's a difference here that I want to point out. And so starting in verse 12, we're going to see the same kind of thing. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, labor 6 days, the 7th day is a rest. And then in verse 15, you are to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahweh your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. In Exodus, like I say, they'd only been out of Egypt for a couple months. And so they well remember that there was no Sabbath for them in Egypt. They were slaves. They had worked hard 7 days a week, if that's what their taskmasters told them to do. It wasn't like the taskmaster came and said, oh, you Israelites, we know you have a rest day every seventh day. Not a chance. In Exodus, it was very fresh on their minds that they had been slaves and that in many cases they were forced to work 7 days a week. By the time we get to Deuteronomy, we've now gone 40 years. Deuteronomy is written in the 11th month. It's written within a month. It's written the 11th month of the 40th year. Now you're looking at almost by Deuteronomy's time, I would venture to say, with the exception of perhaps a few individuals, every male who'd come out of Egypt that was over 20 had passed away. And so you're dealing with a whole new generation that didn't experience the slavery in Egypt. It didn't experience what it was like to have to work as a slave 7 days a week. And so here God's going to make the point a little differently. He's not going to say, well, I created the world in 6 days and the seventh day I rested. He's going to say, you were a slave in Egypt and I brought you out by a mighty hand. Therefore, because of that, I command you to keep a rest day. And even your slaves have to rest. And I think, this is an important point, because today in the administration of grace, we don't have to keep a Sabbath, but it's debilitating over a period of time to work 7 days a week. As a human being, you have got to give yourself rest. And God here talks about the Sabbath in contrast to being in Egypt when they had to work 7 days a week. So if you tend to be a workaholic, my godly advice to you is figure out a way to take a rest day. And if you can't take a full day, take as much time as you can. And, and even during the week, if you've got an hour, don't fill up every single hour of your life with, as soon as you don't have anything to do, well, I'm going to watch TV, which is, anybody that studies this knows that watching TV stimulates your brain, stimulates your body, that kind of thing. human beings need a rest, and God designed that into the history of life. So we've got a daily offering that has to be done every day. We've got a Sabbath that every 6 days people are going to rest. And sometimes God uses the phrase, it's a day to afflict your souls. I don't have one of those right on the top of my head, but if we read through those, it'll talk about it's a day to afflict your soul. And that's where sometimes in the deprivation of not being able to build a fire, if your fire burns up the wood, you didn't get enough wood and you're a little chilly, oh well, that kind of thing, where the word of God is more important than our comfort. And that's definitely a message that we get from the Sabbath. Now, the next thing that came up, and it could come up, during any day during the week, is the new moon. So let's go to Numbers 28. Let's go back to Numbers 28. And the new moon thing can be a little tricky to track by doing concordance searches, because in Hebrew, the word month is the word moon. And so, for example, we're going to go to Numbers 28, verse 11, and most of your English versions are going to say something like the REV does, in the beginning of your months. But if you look at the word month, it can be moon. And we've got a footnote about that. And there are some versions, if you look at the commentary, that say at the new moon. But the beginning of your months is probably a better translation for the fluidity of the Hebrew. What we need to know is, okay, here's God, and he's already set up, there's a daily set of offerings. Now he doubles that as an addition if it happens to be a Sabbath. And now he's going to say, well, you've got another set of offerings if it happens to be the first day of the month. Now, if the first day of the month is also, of course, it's a regular day and it's a Sabbath, you've already got 3 animals being sacrificed in the morning and all that stuff. And here comes the new moon. So verse 11, in the beginning of your months, you are to offer a burnt offering to Yahweh, 2 bulls and 1 ram, 7 male lambs, a year old without blemish, 3/10 parts of an ephah of fine flour for a grain offering mixed with oil for each bull, 2/10 parts of fine flour for a grain offering mixed with oil for the 1 ram, and 1/10 part of fine flour mixed with oil for a grain offering for each lamb. So there was 7 of them, if you remember, for a burnt offering for a pleasant aroma, an offering made to fire by Yahweh. And their drink offerings are to be 1/2 a hin of wine for a bull, 1/3 part of a hin for a ram, 1/4 part of a hin for a lamb. This is the burnt offering of every month throughout the months of the year. So particularly the priests who were responsible to fulfill this law had to keep diligent track of not only Sabbath, but also they had to keep, you didn't have to keep track of every day because it was every day. To keep track of a Sabbath, and you had to watch when the new moon was. And if the new moon and the Sabbath were going to fall on the same day, then there was an awful lot of preparation to do. And one of the things, if you're reading along or sort of following of the commentary that I've got in Leviticus, one of the things that you begin to notice is that the scripture references that are there are scattered. Heaven forbid that there should be just a list in the Bible someplace that would give us this. And there are lists that give us parts of most of it, but there's no list that gives us the entire picture, lock, stock, and barrel. And that's really challenging, when we think about it. And then part of that is because God's going to add, by the time Moses wrote the law of Moses, God is going to then add things like the Feast of Dedication, which was, I believe, 167. Yeah, 167 BC. He's going to add the Feast of Purim, which was about 500-ish BC. So they're feasts in this early list of Moses. There are feasts that are not in this early list of Moses because they simply weren't added to God's calendar yet. So it's much more challenging to put together a complete list of these things. Just to get an idea as we lean back, because sometimes I think about time to pray, and it's like trying to find a 15 or 20-minute block of time in my day when I can just sit, close my eyes, and just pray and let the Lord feed me things. Lord, what do you want prayed for? Instead of coming to you with my prayer list, which I do a lot, Lord, what do you have on your heart? And just letting God bring people up for me and things up for me, and finding that 15 or 20-minute time period. And you just feel like, oh man. And yet I look at this stuff, and it's just the time frame that's necessary is just astounding. Plus the fact that we're gonna move from the new moon to Passover, and what God's going to do now is He's going to say there are 3 feasts during the year in which I want everybody to come, and this is kind of interesting. Let's take a quick look at some of these. Exodus 23:14, please. If we go to Exodus 23 in verse 14, it says, "You are to observe a feast to me 3 times a year. You are to observe the feast of unleavened bread. 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month of Abib," that's also called Nisan, "for in it you came out of Egypt. And no one is to appear before me empty-handed." And God's going to repeat this over and over. That when you come to any one of these 3 feasts, you are to bring something to offer to God. He doesn't say what it has to be, but he says you are not to come empty-handed to God. And he goes through the feast of, and then verse 16. And verse 16 can be a little bit of confusing because it starts out and you've now had the feast of unleavened bread. That's associated with Passover. In verse 16, and the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labor of what you sow in the field, and the feast of harvest at the end of the year. And what this tells us is that the feast that you and I know as Pentecost, and the feast at the end of the year that you and I know as the Feast of Booths, which got translated in the King James as the Feast of Tabernacles, and then that kind of stuck, but Tabernacles gives the wrong impression. It's really the Feast of Booths, that they're both called a Feast of Harvest, and they were. The day of Pentecost in June was the end of the grain harvest. That was the end of the barley harvest, the millet harvest, and technically the wheat harvest, although there may be some, grains of wheat that kind of straggled on in colder parts of the country. But Feast of Pentecost was a harvest festival, and here you see that. And then it says the Feast of Harvest at the end of the year, and that's what we call the Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths. And that's when the grape harvest had been harvested, the olive harvest was being harvested, any citrus harvest was being harvested, that kind of thing. So you had 2 feasts of harvest, Pentecost and Feast of Booths, and we want to make sure that we have those straight. And then verse 17, after mentioning these 3 feasts, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, and Feast of Booths, verse 17, 3 times in a year, all your males are to appear before the Lord Yahweh. And that would have been technically all the males that would have been registered as fighting males from 20 to 50. But there would have been people coming who were younger than 20 and people coming who they wanted to come and they were older than 50. But this is one of the things that made life pretty difficult. Like, for example, if you lived in Nazareth, we just did this study work. If you lived in Nazareth and you wanted to get to Jerusalem even if you went through Samaria, it was a 70-mile journey. It was a 3-day journey. So if you're coming to a 7-day feast, like the Feast of Booths, which ended up actually being an 8-day feast, you've got to tack on 3 days at the front end for travel and 3 days at the back end for travel. And that's coming from Nazareth. If you came from, say, Dan, you would need 4 days in each direction. So you got 8 days of travel and an 8-day feast. That means, especially if you're taking all your men of fighting age and you're going to Jerusalem for 2 weeks out of the year and you're completely out of touch, that there's a hidden promise of God here that if you will obey me from the heart, I will protect you, because you're leaving your homes and your families unprotected. Well, you went for basically 16 days off to Jerusalem. And of course, the end result of this is that people didn't do that. I mean, even if you read in 1 Samuel, if you remember, well, let's just go there. Let's just take a look. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 1. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, we're running into the family of Samuel, Hannah, his mother, and Elkanah, his father. And it says in verse 3, now this man would go up out of his city year after year to worship and sacrifice to Yahweh, Yahweh of armies at Shiloh. And the year after year phrase, I guess this may be in a footnote or not a footnote commentary, but that's basically means once a year. So even by the time of Samuel, and even though Ramathaim Zophim isn't very far away from Jerusalem, or certainly Shiloh at this time, where the tabernacle was at the time, I mean, he only went once a year. And that happened a lot, that people would only go one time a year. So that's just kind of what happened in those days. So if we take a look, now the Passover, I can go to Passover. Let's go to Exodus 12:3-11. So Exodus 12:3. And Exodus 12:3 is where the Passover sacrifice was established. And the Passover sacrifice on Passover day, and this is important because here God said, well, on the Sabbath, you got to do these extra sacrifices. On the new moon, you got to do these extra sacrifices. On Sabbath, there wasn't, I mean, a sacrifice on Sabbath. On Passover, there wasn't an extra sacrifice at the temple. The Passover sacrifice was made by every family for themselves. And that's pretty important to keep in mind. And here in Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 4 and ending in verse 11, you see the Passover established. And the one thing I think that people miss with Passover is verse 5, your lamb must be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. And people, forget that or don't really understand that. It doesn't get talked about much in Christianity, but the Passover lamb can Levitically be a Passover goat, because a goat was a clean animal. And some people were goat, they didn't have a lamb, but they had a goat, or they had a friend that had goats that they could buy one. And so what God accepted for the Passover lamb was either a lamb or a goat. And then, continuing on down past, we go to, we start in verse 15, and then verse 15 gets to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So now if we're walking through the calendar, we've got our daily offering, we've got our Sabbath offering. Once a month, we have a new moon and its offerings. And now we have the Passover. And the Passover came up once a year, and that was in the first month of the year. So we go from every day to every 7 days to once a month. Now we go Passover once a year, but it's in the first month of the year. And as we track this, we're going to see that the festive calendar goes through the entire year. Literally, by the time we get to the Feast of Purim, we have the first month of the year covered, months in the year covered, not every single month, but months in the year covered, and then the very last month of the year covered. So the point I would make here is that to God's people who were religious, who were godly, who wanted to obey the will of God, they were dealing with some kind of event, literally just seemingly constantly, either the Sabbath or a new moon or one of the festivals they were supposed to go to, that kind of thing. So we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and here in Exodus 12, it says, verse 15, 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you must put away yeast out of your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh, that soul must be cut off from Israel. And so it was this. This was a serious inconvenience. And I think, again, I want to stress that because that's kind of what happened to me when I started preparing for this teaching. It was like, golly, a lot of this stuff is inconvenient. Now, let me tell you how inconvenient it was. Basically, every woman cooked with leaven. Leaven is yeast. And if a major staple in your life is bread, which it is, in the Bible, bread is called the staff of life because you'd lean on it to support yourself. It was the staff, the walking stick of life was bread. It was the staple of the culture. And so how are you going to have good tasting bread? You're going to have yeast. So basically every house has yeast. So imagine, and you guys know like what it's like to clean up your house, straighten things up and put up Christmas decorations. And now you got to move your furniture around so there's room for the tree and all this different stuff. And here's here comes the Feast of Passover and God and unleavened bread, and God says you get all the yeast out of your house. Well, gosh knows where it is. There's some stuck to the table. There's some in a closet. There's some in a jar over there. There's some in the bread that I've got in the pantry. It's kind of everywhere, and I've got to get it out of my house. This is a major cleaning event. In fact, so much so that what happened through history, and you guys are well aware that the Jews, the religious leaders were not godly men. We see that when they confront Jesus Christ. I'm using that in general. There were definitely godly men among them, but in general, there was an air of ungodliness about the Jews. And so what became a custom, and I'm not exactly sure when this became a custom, but you can find it in all the modern customs books that speak about this, is let's say you and I are neighbors, and I've got to get rid of all my yeast, and you've got to get rid of all your yeast. And so I go over to you and say, how much would you take for all your yeast in your house? I mean, if I bought all the yeast in your house, I mean, $200, would that be okay? And you go, yeah, that would work. How much for the yeast in your house? And I say, $150. And you say, okay. And so we swap money, and now you don't own the yeast in your house. So you don't have to get rid of it because it's not yours. And I don't have to get rid of that yeast in my house because it's not mine. And then after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I go over to you and say, you know what, I found out I need my yeast. I'll give you your $200 back. You say, okay, and I'll give you your $150 back. And so now again, I own my yeast and you own your yeast. And like I say, you can read about this in some of the customs book, like by Mackey and some of those other guys that do a really good job. But the Jews were always trying to, and why would they do this? Because some of the laws were so inconvenient. And I just want to go to Malachi chapter 3. I mean, I just think it's really important that we understand what was going on here among the priesthood. Let's see. God's talking about how he'll bless the people if they do things right. Verse 13, your words have been strongly against me, says Yahweh. Yet you say, what have we spoken against you? You've said, now he's talking to the priests, it's vain to serve God. It's useless. It's a waste. That's what vain means. It's useless to serve God. It's useless to do all this stuff about the yeast. It's useless to do all this stuff about the firewood. It's useless to do all this stuff about the water. And granted, Hebrews says they have to do it over and over and over again, and they did, but that was their job, and they were living off the production of the people. He says, it's vain to serve God. What profit is it that we have followed his instructions and that we have walked as if in mourning before Yahweh of armies? And why would they do that? Because the things of God are inconvenient. And I'm bringing this up again because sometimes, I talk to people and they make it sound like taking time out of their life to read the Bible is the world's most inconvenient, horrific thing you could possibly do. It may be inconvenient, but it's how we draw close to God. Taking time to pray may be inconvenient, but it's how we join into God's army and get things done on earth. You can just tell from this whole priestly, feastly thing that God isn't particularly into convenience. And he talks about some of these fast days, that's a day to afflict their soul. Let's go to Numbers 28, verse 17. Numbers 28 is, let's see, we've been to Numbers 28 before, probably be there again. And the feast of, and so we're at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and here's the offering, and starts in verse 16. First month is Passover, and note that there's no special offerings for Passover. The Passover sacrifice is done by every family. Verse 17, on the 5th day of the month is to be a feast. It doesn't call it here the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but that's what it is. For 7 days, leavened bread is to be eaten. On the first day, there's to be a holy assembly. You are to do no customary work. In other words, get your your firewood ready and all that stuff, and your cold food ready, because you're not going to be able to cook. You're not going to be able to make a fire. Verse 19, but you're to offer an offering made by fire, a burnt offering to Yahweh, 2 young bulls, 1 ram, and 7 lambs a year old. They are to be without blemish. And then he goes through. The next is the grain offering. And then verse 22, a male goat for a sin offering. And verse 23, you were to offer these along with the morning burnt offering. That's your regular burnt offering. This is the way you were to offer every day for 7 days. So again, the regular offering is not put aside. If it's the Sabbath offering is not put aside. If it's a new moon, the new moon offering is not put aside. This is the first day of unleavened bread, and it's got its whole complete set of offerings. Then the next feast on the calendar is what we call Pentecost, which in the Old Testament was never called Pentecost. It was called the Feast of Weeks. And actually it's coming up right here. So let's take a look. Verse 26. It says, also on the day of first fruits, when you offer a new grain offering to Yahweh at your Feast of Weeks. So when you showed up with your first fruits of your harvest, this is Pentecost, and the harvest is going, the grain harvest, you're supposed to show up with, new grain at your Feast of Weeks. And so it was also known as the day of first fruits, because you brought your first fruits. You are to have a holy assembly. You are to do no customary work, but you're to offer a burnt offering for a pleasant aroma to Yahweh, 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs a year old, and their grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for each bull, 2/10 of an ephah for the 1 ram, and 1/10 of an ephah, wow, for every lamb of the 7 lambs, and 1 male goat to make atonement for you. Besides the regular burnt offering and the grain offering of it, you are to offer them and their drink offerings. So again, this here's the day of Pentecost. this was what was going on in the temple when people came to the temple. By the way, the day of Pentecost is the only one-day feast in the calendar. And that's one of the reasons that there were probably less people that came to Pentecost than the other feasts. Because, you know, like if you're coming from Dan and you got to travel for 4 days, you'd at least like to be there for a 7 or 8 day feast. Where if you're going to travel for 4 days, be in the temple for 1 day and then walk 4 day home, that's an awful lot of effort. And frankly, historically, a lot of Jews didn't do that. So that was Pentecost. Then let's go to Numbers chapter 29. We're here in Numbers chapter 28. We go to chapter 29. Now, what you and I know is Rosh Hashanah. Rosh is the Hebrew word for head, Hashanah, the year. The feast is literally the head of the year. We call this New Year's Day. The Jews call it Rosh Hashanah, and that is the first day of the 7th month. Now, the Hebrew calendar can be kind of confusing, so I'm going to say this, and then I've got commentary on it in a couple different places. But from the time of Adam until the time of the Exodus, Exodus chapter 12, the first month of the year was Tishri. In Exodus chapter 12, at the time of the Exodus, God changed the calendar. He's starting a brand new nation. With the Exodus, you went from 12 tribal groups to the nation of Israel under one head, and that head was Moses. Later, that one head became Joshua, and then it moved on, passed through the judges, and then by the time you got to Samuel, they said, we want to make a king. But Israel moved into Egypt as 70 people, and it came out of Egypt as a nation of countless thousands. And so one of the things that God did to, if you will, emphasize that point is he rotated the calendar by 6 months. Tishri had been the first month of the year. Now Nisan, also called Abib, was the first month of the year, and Tishri was the 7th month. And this can be confusing in some ways because when God has Rosh Hashanah, he uses the 7th month. And yet he himself said that Nisan was going to be the first month. It's like, wait a minute, hey God, what are you doing here? And so there are some of the things in the biblical calendar that track from Nisan as the first month. And there are some things in the biblical calendar that track from Tishri as the first month. For example, the Sabbath year started not on a Nisan 1, but on Tishri 1. The year of Jubilee didn't start on Nisan, but started on Tishri 1. So that's just stuff to be aware of. And frankly, this is why a lot of people just say, it's too confusing. I don't need to know all this stuff. And that is true. You know, you don't have to hold all this stuff in your mind, but if you're reading the Bible and it seems confusing, then you want a study Bible or commentary that points you in the right direction. So here, verse 1 would say, in the 7th month or the 7th moon, on the first day of the moon, again, here we have, now we're gonna double up, because with the 7th month, it's a new moon, so we have the new moon offerings, but now God's gonna add offerings for the fact that also this new moon is the new religious year, if you will. So he says the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you are to have a holy assembly. You are to do no customary work. It's a day of blowing of shofars for you. In other words, people were to walk around kind of like we do on the 4th of July, where people walk around with fireworks or firecrackers or whatever, and they walked around and, you know, they blew shofars, people blew shofars. And then verse 2, you are to offer a burnt offering for a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. one young bull, one ram, 7 male lambs, a year old without blemish. Their grain offering, and you guys are by now familiar with this. There's a grain offering, there's an oil offering, and it goes on, of course, verse 5, and one male goat for a sin offering to make atonement for you, which you've also seen before. Verse 6, in addition to the burnt offering of the regular new moon and its grain offering, and the continual burnt offering, which is the daily burnt offering and grain offering and drink offering, according to the rules for them, as a pleasant aroma, as an offering made by fire to Yahweh. So now, at the very least, on the first day of Tishri, we at least have 3 sets of separate offerings are going on. We have the daily offering, we have the new moon or new month offering, and we have the first day of Tishri offering. And people have to keep this straight, and heaven forbid that this day would fall on a Sabbath, because then you got to throw that offering in too. So that's going on. So now, running through the calendar, we've got Passover 50 days later. That's usually our April. 50 days later, usually our June. You have Pentecost. Then we get to September, and you have Rosh Hashanah, and you have the offerings associated with that. And then we have the Day of Atonement. So let's go to Numbers 29. Well, we're already here. Let's go for Numbers 29, verse 7. On the 10th day of the 7th month, by the way, I should tell you, because you have Tishri 1, and it's a special day. Tishri 10 is the Day of Atonement. Tishri 15 starts the Feast of Booths. Often people that had to travel a long way, like when you read the Day of Pentecost, and it says there are people there from Cyrene, and there are people there from Cyprus, and people from Rome, and all these different places where they obviously traveled a very long time. People that were going to travel a very long time obviously didn't do it every year. And when they did do it, often they picked the fall of the year, because if they got to Israel just before Tishri 1, they got to be there for the day of the blowing of trumpets. They got to be there for the Day of Atonement. They got to be there for the Feast of Booths. So they put a lot of things together, and they would typically stay for the whole festal season of that. So it says, verse the 7, on the 10th day of the 7th month, you're to have a holy assembly, and you are to afflict your souls. And I had pointed out that this occurs more than once. The Day of Atonement was specifically a day where you afflicted your souls. Again, the Pharisees and Sadducees, by the time of Christ, they had decided that what God meant here was a fast, that you were not supposed to eat that day. Now, there are other places this phrase comes up. I don't think it necessarily means that you were to fast, but obviously a lot of people did. It was a special Sabbath, so people didn't cook. If they were going to eat, then they'd have to have prepared the food ahead of time. This is the Day of Atonement, and this is the day that the high priest went in to the Holy of Holies. And he went in only this one day of the year, the 10th day of the 7th month, and he went in twice. He went in once and offered a sacrifice for himself so that he wouldn't die. Then he went back out, he got another sacrifice, and he went in and he offered that sacrifice for the people. And this is all outlined in Leviticus chapter 16, and the entire chapter of Leviticus 16 is all about this Day of Atonement. So yeah, there's 34 verses in Leviticus 16, and so it talks about the offerings in the temple here for the Day of Atonement. Then we get to the Feast of Booths, and here it is starting in verse 12, and this it's so interesting because the Feast of Booths is a 7-day feast. And so the way he talks about it here, it's almost, frankly, annoying to read almost, because you sit there and go, why didn't you just say you do this for 7 days? I mean, if you read it on verse 12, on the 15th day of the 7th month, in the month Tishri, here it's called the 7th month, but just right above, when you have verse 1, you've got Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, happening that month, but then it's called the 7th month, because here's the blending of your two calendars. According to the civil year, it's the 7th month. According to the religious year, it's the 1st month. You're to have a holy assembly. You're not to do any customary work. You're to keep a feast to Yahweh for 7 days. You were to offer a burnt offering, an offering made by fire of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. And look at the intensity here. This is really ramped up compared to the other offerings. 13 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs a year old. They are to be without blemish. So this is in many cases double what's going on in some of the other sacrifices. One of the things, again, it shows us how well prepared the temple priests have to be, because it takes to feed this every single day. Just takes an immense amount of animals. And you can also see why 3 times a year all the priests were to come to Jerusalem, because there were all these special offerings, and the regular priests that were there needed help. You couldn't dump all this work on just this little tiny group of priests. And so you've got the 13 young bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. They're to be without blemish. You've got the grain offering in verse 14. And then, of course, in verse 16, the obligatory 1 male goat for a sin offering. And then it says, beside the regular burnt offerings. And so whatever is needed here, where if it fell on a Sabbath or that kind of thing, all those sacrifices. And then watch what happens here, verse 17. On the 2nd day, you're to offer 12 young bulls. Now you started out on the first day with 13 young bulls, and then 14 male lambs is the same in the grain offering and drink offering. Verse 20, on the 3rd day, 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. So that's the same. Then you go verse 23, on the 4th day, 10 bulls. And I think you're seeing the pattern here. It's dropping a bull for every day. We don't really know why that is. He just did. 26th on the 5th day, 9 bulls. 29 on the 6th day, 8 bulls. 32, and the 7th day is the last day. On the 7th day, 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, the grain offering, the drink offering. Then verse 35, and this can be a little confusing, because it says on the 8th day you're to have a solemn assembly. And the other feasts, like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it was a 7-day feast, and you had a solemn assembly on the 1st day and a solemn assembly on the 7th day. And that made sense. It's a 7-day feast. The Feast of Booths is a 7-day feast. And yet you have a solemn assembly on the 1st day, but then not a solemn assembly on the 7th day. Instead, you have this thing, verse 35, on the 8th day. And this goes without explanation. He calls it a 7-day feast and then adds an 8th day. The rabbis really don't deal with this to speak of, except that 8th day, because it was a solemn assembly, which meant you couldn't travel home. Remember, traveling more than 2/5 of a mile was considered work. So you can't say, I'm going to wait till the 7 days of the feast is over and go home on the 8th day. Because unless you happen to live like super close to the temple, you're not going to be able to go home. And so what happened was the 8th day became a very special day. And that's mentioned with Jesus Christ in John chapter 7, where it says, on the 8th day, the great day of the feast, Jesus Christ spoke up and he said, if anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. And that happened on this 8th day that this is talking about. And then, of course, and it was a holy assembly. And then everybody could go home. And you had the same thing. You had the burnt offerings, you had the grain offerings, you had the 38, obligatory male goat for a sin offering, and of course, besides the regular offerings. And so these are things that people would have to do. And again, God's desire, according to the text, is that he desired people to go for each one of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover, of Pentecost rather, and Feast of Booths, and travel 3 times to Jerusalem. But as I said, customarily, almost no one did. It became pretty much a standard custom that you would pick one of those feasts and go to that. But then, a lot of people, they just simply skipped the feasts for the year and they just said, I can't go this year. So that covers then, now we've done the daily sacrifice, the weekly sacrifice, the new moon sacrifice when it came up, the Passover in the first month of the year, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, following the day after Passover was killed. Then 50 days later, Pentecost, usually came in our June. Then we have, usually in our September, Rosh Hashanah, Tishri the 1st, the head of the year. Then the Day of Atonement, called today Yom Kippur, which was the day that the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. Then you had the Feast of Booths, starting on the 15th of Tishri. And then you have a skip again until Hanukkah, which was the Feast of Dedication, if you want to go to John 10:22. Now, the Feast of Dedication was instituted in 167 BC. And it came about because the Gentiles had been controlling the temple. The Jews took in the Hasmonean Revolution, the Jews took control of the temple back, but because they just got control of the temple back, they didn't have enough oil to keep the menorah lit the way it was supposed to. And they said, we've got enough oil for one day. And they put it in the light, and the light burned for 8 days. And so this became then the Feast of Dedication. It was set up in 167. And if we go, like I say, to John chapter 10, and I will get there myself in just a second. John chapter 10, and in verse 22. Then came the Feast of Dedication at Jerusalem, and it was winter. And the Feast of Dedication normally falls in our December. And by the way, December in Israel is cold. If you look at, if you see pictures of Jerusalem, you can Google pictures of Jerusalem in the snow. And even this year, 2022, in 2022 in January, there was a large snow in Jerusalem. So even this year in Jerusalem, when all the weather's supposed to be warming up, there was quite a snow in Jerusalem in January. So everybody had definitely their winter clothes on, but excuse me, that's why it says it was winter. So you've got the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the first month of the year. Now you're moving through to where you're in like the 9th month of the year, and it's winter time, and Jesus is walking in the temple, and that's the Feast of Dedication, also by the Jews today called Hanukkah, or the Feast of Lights. And then you have the Feast of Purim. Now the Feast of Purim falls in the month of Adar, and that's the 12th month of the year. Let's take a look at Esther chapter 9. And so, if you don't know the story of Esther, it's a wonderful book to read. But this evil man named Haman was trying to kill off the Jews, and he cast lots to see when he should approach the king to ask that the Jews be destroyed. And of course, it all worked against him, and he ended up being killed. And the Jews then took control of the situation and cleaned house on a number of their enemies. And verse 26 of Esther chapter 9 says, therefore they called these days Purim, from the word pur, which means lot. That's because Haman cast lots. Therefore, because all that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter and what happened to them, the Jews established and took it upon themselves and upon all their descendants and on all those who joined themselves to them, that without fail they would keep those 2 days according to what was written and at the appointed time every year, and that those days would be remembered and kept throughout each and every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim were not to cease among the Jews, nor their memory die out among their seed. And this was about 500 BC. So the Feast of Purim was established about 500 BC, and it's the last feast of the year. So what we have, and I know this has been a challenging teaching to keep up with. There's a lot of detail, and like I say, if you go to the chapter where I've got notes on this, which is Leviticus 23, starting in verse 2, well, in verse 2, the commentary verse 2, and I've got the notes on this, and you can see just by scanning it that this stuff is not in one place. It is scattered all over the scripture. So God wasn't necessarily making it easy for us to understand what he was demanding of his people. But really it takes starting in Exodus, reading through Deuteronomy, getting the scope, remembering where the occurrences were, building a scope of the scripture and getting an idea of what God wants. And like I say, it wasn't convenient. It wasn't convenient for the people. It wasn't always easy. I can't imagine, especially what it was like if you lived in the mountain country, the mountains of Ephraim or Judah, where it got really cold in the winter, and every 7 days, you had to make sure that you had your wood and you had your fire going, because baby, you are not going to build a fire or gather wood to keep yourself warm during that time period if you've let your fire go out on overnight. So there's a kind of a message in here for us about our dedication to God and what he wants. And we're coming up on the celebration of the birthday of Jesus Christ, and for us in the United States, Thanksgiving. And of course, like I say, October 31st is when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, at the risk of his life, by the way. The representative of the Roman Catholic Church in Wittenberg announced this man will be dead within a week. And he would have been, except he was hidden by the rulers in Germany who liked him and protected him, or he would have been killed by the Roman Catholic Church like some others before him had been. So I guess if there's a take-home message in this teaching, it's some of the things God demands of us may be inconvenient, but he's God and we're not. And if we're going to be his faithful servants, we need to step up to the plate and do what he says to do, and not just do what we feel like doing. And that's certainly the lesson that was burned into my soul more deeply than it's ever been doing this study, and realizing how hard I had to work to go to all those different places to get this information together. So thank you for being with me through this. I know this has not been an easy teaching, but I trust between the commentary on Leviticus 23 and just your own study of the scripture, that this stuff will truly bless you. So thank you so much, and God bless you. And for those of you that are part of my Tuesday night fellowship, see you Tuesday.